Land. It's a complicated and interesting topic, and an area which, in the spirit of this conference, is in dire need of reform. The aim of this presentation is to give a quick overview of the key facts about the context of land in Sri Lanka, so everyone is on the same page before our esteemed panelists take the stage. Issues relating to land have contributed to greatly reducing Sri Lanka's overall ranking on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. Sri Lanka scored a very poor 51.9 out of 100 for property registration. World Bank officials found that having gone through the 8 processes required to register land over an average of 39 days, an individual or firm would incur a cost equivalent to 5.5% of the value of the property. For context, an individual registering land in Singapore would have to go through 6 processes that can be completed in just 4.5 days at an expenditure of 2.3% of property value. Also of note is the fact that 82% of land in Sri Lanka is government-owned. This is one of the highest in the world. Here are some key facts about Sri Lanka's land distribution, both in terms of land area and in terms of land area by climatic zone. Of the total 65,600 square kilometers, the majority is classified as agricultural land. By zone, most of the land area of the country is in the dry zone. Note that forest area counts all of the land classified by the authorities as a forest, and not the actual tree cover itself. There's a distinction that becomes clear in slide 6. This slide provides a significant amount of information about Sri Lanka's population, economic activity, and how it relates to our natural geography. There is clearly an agglomeration of people, infrastructure, and economic activity in the southwest wet zone and in the intermediate zones. This agglomeration began occurring largely in the 18th century and later, as the capital of the country switched to Colombo under the colonial powers. As a result of this agglomeration, there was a significant amount of deforestation, as land converted to urban and agricultural applications. This continued in the wet zone until a ban on logging was imposed in 1988, which is why there is so little forest cover despite favorable conditions for plant growth. Indeed, the only parts of the wet and intermediate zones where there is still significant forest cover and limited infrastructure, agriculture, and population density is in the high elevation areas. These are areas above 500 meters from sea level where there is likely limited economic incentive to settle. On the top left, you can see Sri Lanka's current land use. The bottom left and the right of the slide show the change in land use in Sri Lanka between 2000 and 2020. Notable land use conversions can be seen from agriculture to settlements. These are the red patches. In addition, significant transformations can be seen from bare land to agriculture, yellow patches, in both decades. Agriculture land use to settlement land use conversions were 485 kilometers squared from 2000 to 2010, and 1,536 kilometers squared from 2010 to 2020. Further, significant land use conversions can be seen from bare lands to agricultural lands and forest lands in both decades, approximately 6,000 kilometers squared in total. Population growth and finishing the civil war can be 2 possible reasons for these land use conversions. It should be noted that water sources have remained fairly stable despite the developments of the last 2 decades. This is a positive sign that bodes well for Sri Lanka's future water security and supply. This slide shows an overview of the forest land situation in Sri Lanka. There is slightly more state ownership of forest lands than the national average for all lands. As seen from the forest land breakdown, slightly over 20% of the land classified as forest does not actually consist of forest cover. The map on the right shows the different types of forest cover in Sri Lanka. It should be noted that although overall forest cover in Sri Lanka still remains at over 34%, a significant amount of the dense lowland rainforest that originally covered much of the wet and intermediate zones has been lost. On the top left of this slide is a breakdown of how agricultural land is used. The major plantation crops, which include tea and rubber, predominantly consist of export crops. From the top right, you can see that agriculture still contributes to 25% of employment, a significant percentage. However, there is low productivity in this sector, which contributes to the low but still significant contribution to GDP of around 7%. By comparison, China, which also has approximately 25% of the population in agriculture, obtains 16.5% of GDP from it. One reason for this low productivity and output is excessive state involvement in agricultural policy. The state both directs farmers on what types of crop they can grow and on how large their farms are. A result of this is that average farm sizes have been steadily falling, particularly since the 1972 land reforms, which has been causing fragmentation and low productivity growth. This also limits incomes for farmers, particularly when they are directed to grow low-value crops. Sri Lanka is one of the least urbanized countries in the world at 18.1% urbanization by official metrics. However, this may be due to current administrative practices and methods of classifying urban areas. Currently, only those living in areas with urban councils or municipal councils are considered as urban population. Independent experts have calculated that the actual figure, when accounting for agglomeration, is around 45% of the population. In any case, most of our urbanization has occurred over the last 20 years, and particularly in the post-war period, as seen from the diagram above. In fact, Sri Lanka had the highest rate of urbanization in the region from 1999 to 2010, and this has traditionally followed the ribbon development type. In other words, along established roads and highways. Predominantly, the population and urbanization in the country is concentrated in the western province, which accounts for almost 40% of GDP. Sri Lanka's extremely high state land ownership is the result of colonial land policies and subsequently the 1972 land reforms, which imposed a ceiling of land ownership of 20 hectares that still exists to this day. As the statistics on the bottom show, there were many negative impacts as a result of these reforms, and some of their objectives, such as to provide land to the landless, still have not been accomplished today. The 11 to 21% reduction in land value is assessed by the World Bank. It comes about because farmers, who often do not have the full freehold titles to their land, cannot utilize its full value as collateral for loans for investment, which will potentially reduce the future output of the agricultural sector. Degradation of land occurs as a result of high state land ownership. Farmers and even plantations and companies do not really have an incentive to properly preserve their land, as they only have it on a short-term lease. Meanwhile, encroachment on state lands remains high and has contributed to our high deforestation rates, particularly in the wet and intermediate zones. The 1970s land reforms expanded upon the Land Development Ordinance and introduced the Land Reform Act, both of which contributed to our high state land ownership at present. A significant amount of this land was expropriated from foreign corporations, sometimes without payment. Although that land was supposed to be redistributed to the landless, as you can see from the chart on the right, it was primarily redistributed to public agencies and cooperatives, often at the expense of productivity. Sri Lanka's productivity in a number of export crops, such as tea, fell, and they did not recover until privatization reforms were implemented many years later. As the statistics on the bottom show, these reforms greatly reduced the rights of farmers and have had other negative consequences. Finally, BOI zones. BOI zones primarily consist of export processing zones, though industrial parks and industrial zones are also significant. At present, there are 3,800 acres devoted to BOI zones, a figure that is expected to double with new public-private partnership EPZs being planned. BOI zones greatly punch above their weight. They contribute, although they only employ around 6% of the total workforce, they contribute to 42% of total export revenues, particularly from the textile and garment sectors. However, many BOI zones, such as the EPZ in Katunayaka, are currently operating near or at full capacity. It is therefore imperative to expand the capacity of these zones, to construct new ones, and to implement policy to liberalize trade and simplify tax structures in the hope of replicating the success of these zones island-wide. On that note, I'll bring this presentation to a close. Thank you for your attention.
We will now begin the next presentation by Mr. Roshan Rajadurai, the Managing Director of Kalini Valley, Thalawakale and Horona Plantations of Haley's PLC.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Till the PowerPoint comes on, as I stand here, I'm acutely aware that I'm speaking to an audience who had a sumptuous lunch, and it will be a challenging and a daunting task to keep your attention riveted on my subject. I have a different proposition regarding agriculture. I've heard in the morning certain comments and opinions about the agriculture of Sri Lanka, and very quickly, PowerPoint. To get to the subject, I want to make a proposition that the inherent geographical, topography, climatic, and ecosystem of Sri Lankan land provides a favorable platform and can invigorate agriculture, on which about 28% of our people are directly employed, and more so, 77% of our national population is rural-based, and most of these agricultural holders or operators are in the regions. So by invigorating agriculture, we can uplift the quality of life and the lifestyle of about 28% of our population. Looking at the composition of GDP in Sri Lanka, you can clearly see that services and agriculture and industry sector, and when you look at agriculture, paddy is a main crop, apart from coconut, which is a huge extent in terms of plantation crops, and the traditional export-oriented plantation crops like tea and rubber. We have export agriculture crops of 120,000 hectares, fruits, vegetables, and other crops. And very quickly, just to support my contention that agriculture is a very positive feature and that we have to look at it in a very positive way, the objective of our agriculture land use must be to derive or extract optimal utility value from a unit of land on a sustainable basis, so that the people and the country in the social, economic, and environmental, ecological areas benefit. Talking of Sri Lanka, we are a small, tropical, maritime, humid island close to the equator, and we are blessed with adequate rainfall. More so, we have seasons where the whole country is covered in rain, as I will explain later, and about 40% of the rain is surface runoff. Even that is captured in terms of the tanks and reservoir systems in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has 103 rivers, and 15 of them in the wet zone, 20 in the intermediate zone, 8 rivers crossing all the 3 zones, and the largest river covering 10% of our land area. The extensive riverine system is supplemented further by 7,600 tanks. If you look at the employment profile of the 8 million, 27% is in agriculture, and in industries about 46%, and in services another 26%. Sorry, it's the other way around. Agriculture 27%, industries 46%, and services 27%. We are blessed with 6 different land zones, so that different variety of crops can be grown in Sri Lanka. Because of the advantageous location of our Central Hills, which is north-south oriented, all the water is radially flowing down to the low country, and which is a very good advantage for Sri Lanka. You can see the land zones and soil map. We have 23 great soil groups, and all these soil groups in their own support different vegetations, different crops. For example, there is soil type that favors paddy, then cereals and plantation crops. As you see, this is how the land is used in Sri Lanka. We have about 42% of our land devoted to agriculture. Then, as the previous speaker mentioned, about 20% in forest, about 5% in water bodies. You can look at the land use map in Sri Lanka, and 42% of the arable land is distributed mostly in the wet zone. So if you go to the next slide, this is how the cultivated crops are situated in our country. You can see the paddy lands, a concentration of paddy land in the middle of the country. Then the economic crops are towards the west and the center of the country, and the forested area is more towards the north and the south of the country. If you look at the extents of the cultivation, you can see that paddy or rice cultivation takes prominence. Almost close to 850,000 hectares of paddy is cultivated. With 2 seasons, we cultivate about 1.2 million hectares. The important thing is that more than the extent involved, the number of households engaged and dependent on this paddy cultivation. Other important food crops like other food crops is 175,000 hectares, and coconut is close to 400,000 hectares, and the traditional tea 202,000 hectares. Cultivated food crops in all totally surpass 2 million kilos out of a total 4.5 million hectare cultivated. If you look at the agriculture sector of Sri Lanka, where 2.2 million people are engaged, what is significant is a number of people employed. You can see that paddy employs 1.8 million households in Sri Lanka, out of a possible 5.5 million households. Then 700,000 people are engaged in coconut cultivation at ground level. Then another 100,000 people are engaged in coconut production. Then there are 450,000 tea smallholders and 200,000 rubber smallholders, and another 1 million people cared for by the regional plantation companies. So when you look at the agricultural profile, you can see the extent to which the majority of the people, rural folk base, are dependent on the industry for their sustenance and livelihood. Now, when you look at paddy, I think just to give an illustration of the paddy sector, you can see small patches of paddy land right throughout the country. And so tea and rubber, you can see exclusively, they are concentrated in the western Sudaraka and the Central Hills. And when you look at mine export crops, we call it export agriculture crops, again, you can see the concentration of those crops, not mainly in the dry zone, but in the central, western Sudaraka and the areas. So why is agriculture important for Sri Lanka? Number one, it is very important for our food security. Before the pre-pandemic period, we had 90% food security. Of course, we don't know the latest figures now. And again, it's important for nutrition and health. We have 2,030 kilocalories national average, and it is well within the recommended rates by the Medical Research Institute, although other South Asian countries have a higher kilocalorie intake than Sri Lanka. Then it's important for our national sovereignty. If we are secure in our food and we can feed ourselves, we don't have to be indebted and go on our bended knees to other countries to ensure our food supply. Then it provides social security, cohesion to the society. We have seen countries leading on to food riots in the absence of food. So social security aspect, food is very important. Then poverty alleviation. As I mentioned earlier, 77% of Sri Lankan population is rural based, and agriculture is their main source of income. Then obviously for human well-being, for good health, fitness and longevity, agriculture is important. And as I mentioned earlier, almost one quarter, almost 27% of our employed people are employed in agriculture directly, apart from the other amenities and other businesses that are connected to agriculture. Then foreign income. We need dollars, and agriculture is a sure source of foreign income, and more than anything, it provides for effective land use. So let's look at the country scenario. As some speaker mentioned, we have 6.6 million hectares of land, and excluding the water bodies, we have 6.3 million, and agriculture land is 42% of the national land base, and the Central Highlands has 14% of this land. The important thing is 83% of country land and more than one-third of the country's agriculture land is state-owned. We talk of the British colonials taking over the land, but we have persisted with the system even after 150 years. State has an absolute grip, absolute control over the land of this nation. And we have almost 1.3 million state-owned agriculture land compared with 880,000 privately owned agriculture land. Or 42% of the agriculture land, of that, 40% in plantation crops, including tea, rubber, coconut, then probably cinnamon, sugarcane and such. And 28% of this agriculture land is in paddy, our staple crop. Then per capita land area is only 1/10 of a hectare per person, decreasing very fast. And land to man ratio is 0.3, 1/3 of a hectare. And temperature in the low country and the hill country is ideal temperature for any crop growth. I think this is an advantage we in Sri Lanka have, whether it's the wet zone or the dry zone or even the low country, the hill country, we have suitable temperature. And 64% of the land is in dry zone. When I say that, people might think that we are having a water shortage, but later on I will show you that even this is a surmountable issue. And 23% of our land in the wet zone. And of the land in the wet zone, statistics provide that 50% of the land is already under cultivation. For example, Mathura district has close to 70% of the land under cultivation, Kegol has 4%, and Gampa 63%. Dry zone, only 13% of the land is under cultivation. So we have over 2,000 millimeters of annual rainfall, and we have a rural population of 77%, as I mentioned earlier, and urban land use in only 6.8%. So other advantage for Sri Lanka to promote agriculture is that 63% of the population is in that age group of 5 to 59 years. We are not a very old generation, so there is a ready pool of labor coming in the future even to sustain the agriculture. And the significant feature in this agriculture, I heard many comments about the low productivity agriculture. Yes, that is a fact. That is driven because 71% of the lands are below 1 hectare in Sri Lanka, and 27% of the farmers are landless, and 82% of the farmers or people involved in agriculture have less than 2 acres. Anyone involved in agriculture will know, with this kind of a small scale, you cannot have a productive agriculture base. So if you look at the distribution of agricultural land in the districts, you can see that 6 districts, Kurragala, Puttlam, Anuradhapura, Badulla, Mondragala and Ratnapura, they cover 46% of the agricultural land in our country. And when you look at the population profile in matching to this, about 4 districts, that is Central, Southern, Northwestern Province and Western Province, have 65% of our population. So this is how the spread of the land is, and most of the arable area is available in, unfortunately, in the dry areas like Vaunia, Mana and Kilinochchi and Batiklo. If you look at the agriculture employment, out of the 8.4 million people employed in agriculture, 26%, that is 2.2 million people are employed directly. But unfortunately, as mentioned, our GDP contribution is only 7%. This is with 700,000 people engaged in coconut and 450,000 tea smallholders. These are major foreign income earning crops and 2,000 rubber smallholders. Main feature of this is that our agriculture is subsistence scale and not large commercial scale agriculture in general. Of this agriculture employment of 2.2 million, we have 1.2 million, almost 50% own account workers, and contributing family workers another 21%. So when you combine both own account workers and the family workers, they constitute 70%. Sorry, it's technology. 70% of the agricultural labor force, and this is also another issue in having commercial and productive agriculture, because family labor and account workers do not have guaranteed regular work. They don't have regular salaries or statutory dues and other benefits and facilities of corporate sector workers. I'm comparing them with the workers engaged in tea and rubber plantations. And out of the total population of 9.1 million people engaged in agriculture, there are 2.6 million households. That is, out of 5.5 million households, almost 2.6 million households in Sri Lanka are engaged in agriculture. Now, 66% of these households own less than 2 acres. So with this kind of a scenario, I think it's not practical to look at large-scale commercial agriculture, and therein lies the solution that I think is a good point to convince the government to let go of the available agriculture land for commercial agriculture. Then research has found that 56% of these agriculture households, their highest share of income comes from agriculture. So the balance, although they engage in agriculture, the balance 46% of the people, their highest share of income comes from employment outside agriculture. So if you look at their wages and salaries, screen is not working. If you look at their wages and salaries, we find that the mean income for agriculture is 23,720 rupees compared to the people engaged in industry, almost 35,000, and services at 43,000. So herein lies, it is not a very attractive sector to be in, because agriculture workers are earning less than half of that of those employed in services. If you look at the median income also, it's about 20,000 as opposed to 30,000 for people engaged in the industry and about 38,000 for people engaged in the services. So this is one of the reasons that there is no attraction. There is no, people are not coming in adequate numbers to agriculture, because agriculture is basically a daily wage-based job. And if you look at the median income of agriculture-based workers, it's only 16,000 rupees compared to even 24,000 people in the industry. So this is a feature of our agriculture, and this is one of the reasons that agriculture is not an attractive proposition in Sri Lanka. If you go to the agriculture holdings, it clearly shows that almost 82% of the agriculture land is classified as small holdings, meaning less than 20 acres, that's about 8 hectares, and the balance 17% shown as estate sector is lands more than 20 acres. So most of the coconut lands would qualify under estate sector, and any land, perennial crop worth its name, will have definitely more than 20%. So while agriculture holdings and extent has increased, when you compare with 1982 to 2014, you can see an increase. One of the reasons is the population growth and the cessation of the hostilities in the north and east, and having the war ended, people started settling down and restarting the cultivation. With all this, the picture clearly demonstrates that agriculture, although 27% of our people are engaged in it, our contribution is very minimal. It's only 7 to 8% in the GNI, in the GDP. And if you look at the distribution, you can see that service sector is providing 63% to the GDP, whereas agriculture is a measly 8%. And how this is distributed is, you can see that main contributor to the gross national income at district level is rice and fruits. Tea and rubber come down because they are mostly export agriculture crops. And this will show you the agricultural land extents. You can see that districts in the northwestern province have more agricultural land as well as Sudaraka more. And this is very interesting. In the breakdown of provincial GDP, Northwestern province has the highest percentage of oleaginous foods, that is coconut and associated, whereas fruits also play a predominant role. A feature of this is when you take the top three provinces, we find that in most cases, three provinces provide about 60 to 60% of the total value of certain crops. For example, in rice, if I take rice, Eastern province and North Central and Southern province alone, these three districts alone provide almost 2/3 of the rice income. If you look at the tea, of course, obviously, is centered about Central, Southern and Uva province. So likewise, we see a feature where certain crops are concentrated, and this makes a strong case for zoning and concentrating on certain crops in certain districts where favorable infrastructure, the labor and the climate is already available. If you look at the current trends, now that is agriculture features that I discussed, you can see that from about 18% to 19% in the 1995 to 2005 era, we have dropped down to 7% by 2020. So there's a steady decline in the contribution of agriculture to our GDP. Likewise, employment, agriculture sector used to employ 36% in the not too distant past in 1995, having come down to 25% or 27% now. Although contribution to the GDP declined more than 50% for the last 2 decades, it is the second highest contribution in terms of employment. So the main source of livelihood for rural population, which accounts for 77% of our population, is agriculture. But that is marked by lowest gross wage or salary in all the three sectors, as I explained earlier, with a median income of 20,000 per month compared to almost 40,000 in the services. So these phenomena, the attractiveness of agriculture, the real salary levels and other benefits of agriculture is not a phenomena confined to Sri Lankan only. We find that in the South Asian region from 2010 to 2019, agriculture employment had a negative growth of 8.5% compared to a positive growth of 1.3% in services. So that is, sometimes you might think that agriculture is a no-hoper, it's not an industry that people must invest, but look at these strides. Now, when you look at the major rivers in Sri Lanka, every part of the country, every district practically is covered by rivers. You can see rivers going through every district and every part of our country. And look at the dry zone, which we consider that it is not suitable for agriculture. It has 64% of the land area, and you can see a concentration of rivers and tanks in the dry zone. This can be further explained. You can see the river system. It's a river network is like a sieve over the country. Wherever you look, you can see a river and stream network, and supported by, I told you, some concentration of reservoirs in the dry zone. So ours is not a country that is short of water, that we have to look for water. And again, apart from the rivers and reservoirs, we have irrigation schemes. And our groundwater is more than adequate for agriculture. And we are talking of climate change. If you look at climate change, it is projected that by 2050, our intermediate zone will expand. So that means we are having less extent in what we call the dry zone, and more land will come in suitable for agriculture enterprises. So while for most countries climate change has a negative connotation, I believe that it is, in my opinion, it is going to be positive for Sri Lanka. Right. So having all the advantages, having a huge land mass engaged in agriculture, 1/4 of our people employed in agriculture, with this supportive irrigation and riverine system, we are still in a very bad position. I just want to illustrate that. Paddy is our staple crop. 1.8 million people are engaged in paddy cultivation. But if you look at the figures, the paddy farmers are in eternal debt cycle. This explains The loans they have taken, the green bar explains the loans they have taken, and the red bar shows you the loans they have paid. So there is always, if you look at the last 5 years or so, the paddy farmer has not been able to pay up the loans that he has taken. So he is in an eternal debt cycle. And this is not only applicable to paddy, this is applicable to other crops as well. So this is an illustration that while we have all the advantages, our agriculture workers, our agriculture sectors are not thriving. So if you look at the rice imports in Sri Lanka, in 2020, we imported rice worth rupees 2 billion, 1.936 million rupees worth of rice was imported. In 2017, we imported 740,000 tons of metric tons of rice. Another important thing is, it says other foods. We have spent 137,558 million. That is 48% of all our food and drink expenditure has gone to import other food. So having all the supportive agricultural base, having 25% of our people engaged in agriculture, still we have to resort to import food. Now another interesting thing in Sri Lanka, it doesn't connect to agriculture, we are surrounded by the ocean. We are an island, but we are imported rupees 19,215 billion worth of dried fish, food for thought. And other fish, it says, probably salmon, tin fish, rupees 15,844,000. So we have imported fish in dried or other forms, being an island, 35,959 rupees worth, and that import is 73% of our fertilizer import bill for the whole of agriculture, including paddy, tea, rubber, vegetable and other crops. Our food import bill is usually 2.5 billion US dollars. So I look at this sector as a sector having enormous potential to develop agriculture. It's not the dead end, it probably is a start because we have this kind of potential and this is the scenario currently. So what I feel is agriculture sector is like a huge giant tied down by thousands of small strings. I think all of you all are familiar with the story of Gulliver, right? Even thousands of small strings can tie down a giant. So I think that is what has happened to our agricultural sector in Sri Lanka. What are the features? Very briefly, in the interest of time, why has the agriculture sector come to this state, or why is it a sleeping giant? How can we wake it up? If you look at our agriculture sector, one of the features is very low land and labor productivity. One of the reasons is quite obvious because it's a small scale of operations. When you have quarter acre or less, I don't think you can make an economic go of running agriculture profitably or successfully. Then we have improper land use, and resulting from that, improper agronomy and agricultural practices. Then, as I explained earlier, small size of farm holdings lead to low farm family income due to small land ownership. Now, for example, a major economic crop in Sri Lanka is tea. The smallholder sector, right, they are self-supportive. They are not depending on the government. The tea industry runs on its own. The smallholder sector with 450,000 operators, the average land holding size is 59 to 60 perches. So with 59 to 60 perches, they make their living. And of course, paddy is only 2 acres. Anyone involved in paddy knows that with 2 acres, you cannot make a successful enterprise. And declining land under cultivation. Because of this reason, shrinking of cultivable land due to urbanization, population growth, and mainly since of late, land degradation. We had a classic example of that in the last week, flash floods that probably destroyed many hectares of vegetable cultivation and crop land in the upcountry. Then poor knowledge and awareness by operators and underutilization and misuse of lands. Land degradation comes under misuse. High labor component cost in the cost of production of agriculture produce. Because of our small scale, because of the low use of technology and appropriate agricultural practices, the labor cost component is fairly high compared to the other industries and other countries. And another important thing is insecurity of tenure and ownership terms. In terms of, even in commercial agriculture, An example is the plantation sector, where it's a long-term crop and we have uncertainties about the tenure. We have 20 years to go before the lease runs out. Up to now, there is no guarantee or there is no indication that the lease should be continued. So no investor would invest. Normally, a rubber crop takes 30 years and a tea crop about 50 years. So there should be some indication of continuity if investors are going to invest in land. So this applies in the small scale as well. Then already discussed diseconomies of scale. Even if you take our major commercial crops like tea, which I'm familiar, in Sri Lanka, tea estate is about 200 to 250 hectares on average, compared to the better tea economies like in Kenya, which is about 1,000 hectares. So these diseconomies of scale at a certain point brings huge disadvantages, but we have made that as a strength in Sri Lanka, and we produce different types of diverse tea to keep ahead of the competition. Then low use of technology, innovation, and the small size and lack of capital means low mechanization and automation in the agriculture sector, and the climate impact. Since ours is a small country, a slight change in the environment will have significant impact on the ground in topography and climate. Then, as explained earlier, our agriculture is predominantly subsistence and homestead crop farming systems. Even now, we have shifting agriculture that is a chainer system. So there is no guarantee of price for the producer. And because it's an informal sector, almost 91% of the agriculture workers are informal. That means their employment is seasonal because they don't own the land, and there is no crop insurance or policy in terms of social safety net. And then the government policies. This is one of the key areas that has had a severe impact on agriculture. Most of the deficiencies in agriculture are follies created by us, which could have easily been avoided. I have to point out the unwise decision of first banning glyphosate in 2015. That had repercussions for not only the export agriculture crops, but also in the paddy sector, because paddy farmers and maize farmers didn't have the glyphosate for weed management, and you can see that the country had to import rice. And of course, the latest that everybody knows, the ban on fertilizer and weedicides and fungicides. Already, we see a decline of 20% in export crops such as tea, and rubber we have had a drop of about 40%. And I'm sure the paddy harvest also will be impacted to a significant amount because of these inputs that had not gone in the appropriate time. And these have long-term irreversible effects. So then other features of the sector is, I think this was discussed, multiplicity of state agencies and ministries. At one time, I recall, for the plantations alone, we had about 9 ministries. One for cashew, one for sugarcane, one for tea, one for JDB. So this is one of the salient aspects of our industry. Then we have complex administrative and land governance systems. We have 39 operational land laws limiting flexibility. Information system asymmetry, markets and the farmer at the ground level doesn't know. I think we have all read about gluts of vegetables at one time. They allow it to rot and farmers committing suicide. That is because our system is not attuned to give the right information, market information to the growers on the ground. Then we have poor infrastructure facilities for transport and storage. Then we have plethora of laws, and mostly excessive, regulations and controls, and long drawn-out approval protocols, and some very archaic laws. Now, in terms of agriculture, timing is everything. You need to do certain things at a certain time, and if you do not do it at that time, then that exercise is useless. So we have enough of examples of all these bureaucracy and the delays it entails. Of course, we have archaic labor laws, as explained earlier, and people don't like to employ or engage regular workers in agriculture because agriculture has its seasonality feature. So then there are some times of the year that you have to have less work, but our labor laws do not permit such a flexibility. Then political will to make unpopular decisions. Classic case is the oil palm. There's much debate, but science has proved that it is not detrimental to the soil if properly cultivated. It's a very, very valuable cash crop. At least 1 million rupees profit as opposed to rubber that you have to run it at a loss. So when you have profits, the industry and the people engaged in it prosper. So these are some of the decisions that the policymakers have to take. Accelerated outmigration of skilled and talented people from the industry. Most of the farmers are aging. Within 4 years, the average age of farmers has gone up to about 55 years, according to statistics. That means young people are not coming in for work, the older people are remaining. For the age group of 19 to 24, less than 1% are in agriculture. So that means agriculture is definitely not an attractive proposition for them. So that is the most productive, and that's the age people can put their labor, because agriculture is a very labor-intensive job. But you can see that there is no attraction in agriculture for youngsters. Then, of course, low status, societal acceptance and dignity for agriculture work. We understand that no farmer's son or no one will want to continue as a farmer, or even a tea or rubber estate tapper would not want the children to continue. So we need to change and introduce different working models to make the farming or agricultural work attractive to the people engaged in those areas. Then we have commoditization of the product. And that is one important reason why agriculture has not taken off. Look at the case of tea. 150 years of existence in our country. Even now, we are sending only 10% in the value-added form. We call it value-added, but it's boxes and bags. I don't believe that is real value addition. So the grip, the control of the retailer is very much evident. We can only send 10% as value-added form. So then our product range and quality has to diversify. The low institutional support for research and development, weak extension and research. So I'm not going to go through that. I think this will be in the conference proceedings. So very quickly, I want to just touch on way forward because of the interest of time. Main thing, the 82% of the land that the government is holding, they have to let it go in a scientific, methodical manner. How they can do that is to have a non-partisan expert panel to advise and set permanent policy on agriculture, right? And government must stop meddling in agriculture. They should not get involved in the business of business, which is not the business of government. National land policy, GIS mapping. I say GIS mapping in Korea, they have mapped every acre or even smaller and identify the soil and the ecosystem there and recommended plants and crops that can be grown. So we also can adopt it. Then centralize agriculture-related ministries, consistency and of policy, liberalize land tenure, free up land held by the state and consolidate the small holdings and support research, use state resources. Surely we can use our resources and clear a lot of available agricultural lands and have agriculture zones like the BOI and give 100 hectares or 200 hectares for willing companies to start agriculture in the dry zone. We have enough water facilities and irrigation facilities. Encourage wider technology, level playing field for the producer giving fair value, correct the information asymmetry and have supportive infrastructure. And all this will encourage external investments in commercial agriculture. So I have some more points. I'm sure this is all very quickly. Digital inventory, land suitability and land utilization plans, equitable land use policies, provide stimulus. Now this is very important. If you are going to promote agriculture like what the government did when the coffee industry was decimated and tea came in, they provided so much of stimulus to promote tea. So likewise, we'll have to provide a lot of stimulus to expand our agriculture with and the different crops to be grown, weather and forecasting and early warning systems. And another important thing is stop illogical expropriation of land. We have many cases where productive crop-bearing land have been taken over by the government and allowed to go to rack and ruin. Then finally, degradation, encroachment and erosive land use must be stopped and monitor agriculture land, fragmentation, scarcity and conversion of agriculture land to other uses. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to finish now. We need to change the perspective. Enough time arguing whether agriculture is good or bad. There is a definite potential for improvement of our agriculture sector if we can take the right policies. and we need to look at agriculture as something positive and not something that is deadbeat, right? There is potential, the people, the culture, the history, and we have people experience in agriculture to turn around the agriculture sector. So despite all the ups and downs in agriculture, one product has kept Sri Lanka's agriculture in the forefront. I'm talking about Ceylon tea. For 150 years, it has been a global brand, and it still continues to be the most sought after beverage in Sri Lanka. And I want to conclude that in the agriculture, we are the flag bearers, and Ceylon tea is still the best. So keep drinking Ceylon tea. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan. Now I invite the rest of the panel on the stage. I would like to welcome Mr. Indrajith Fernando, the former Land Commissioner, along with the moderator, Sudaraka Ariyaratne, a research associate at the Advocata Institute. Over to you, Sudaraka.
Thank you, Anuka, for that introduction, and thank you, Dr. Rajadurai, for that very informative presentation. Contrary to what it says on the name board, it should read Dr. Rajadurai. In fact, I should mention that he has not just one PhD, he has multiple doctoral degrees, so sorry for the oversight. I think I will jump straight into the questions. So my first question is to Dr. Rajadurai. We all know that private smallholders in the tea sector own just actually 60% of the land, but their contribution to the tea production is actually 70%. So they actually are much more productive than the estate sector, where the land is originally owned by the government and now managed by the private sector. So do you think the land ownership has something to do with productivity in this case?
Yeah, it's obvious because when you have such small holdings, in the case of the smallholder, as I told earlier, average smallholder landowning size is 60 perches. And generally now, if you look at the figures, they have come to a maturity stage. There was a period in the 1970s when suddenly the tea market changed. Countries in the former Soviet Union and the Middle East, flushed with oil money, they were able to pay a very high price for the type of tea that the low country estates made. So everybody practically went in for tea cultivation, and as a result, the dynamics shifted from the large estates to the smallholder sector, which has been a very, very good sector, dynamic sector, employing close to 500,000 people on the ground. And one of the limitations is the land, because there is no land, but there is enough cultivable land in the regions. And as I said earlier, the government should put in a mechanism to distribute that land to people willing to cultivate. Probably this is not the best time because we are beset with other challenges, but people have the appetite to take the land. Very interesting fact that our data was not up to date. Up to about 2000, we had 222,000 hectares of tea land. Of course, corporate sector is all very accurate and is well documented. Suddenly, last year, I see in a couple of days, central bank says now the tea land is 267,000 hectares. That means for about 20 years, we have unaccounted, in terms of statistics, tea land that was not included in the hectareage being counted. So the smallholder productivity in Sri Lanka is about 1,400 kilos yield per hectare, vis-a-vis the company estates at about 1,300. You cannot compare both because there are very, very peculiar situations operating. Ours is a daily paid employment, whereas the smallholder is entrepreneurial employment. So that's the difference.
Yes, Dr. Rajadurai, thank you so much. My next question is for Mr. Indrajith Fernando. I think we have guests joining us here from all kinds of backgrounds, and it may not be immediately clear to them how land policy might necessarily be directly related to the dairy industry or the livestock industries. So it would be great if you could explain what exactly is the link between land ownership reform and the dairy industry.
Actually, as you know, about 7% is contributed to GDP from agriculture, and out of that, close upon 2% is from livestock. And in the livestock sector, major contributor is dairy. So if you take dairying especially, it will need a lot of land because you have to grow pasture to feed the animals. And in Sri Lanka, most of the farmers, more than 95% of the farmers are rural farmers who does not have land or very little land. And even when they have land, this land is used for other agricultural crops as well because they are not 100% engaged in dairy. They cultivate other crops also. So this has created a big problem because if you take the average daily production of a cow is around 3 liters a day. That is mainly because our animals are not fed properly. Otherwise, these animals have a potential to produce more than that. But normally, because these farmers does not have land, they feed the animals by the roadside or some other people's land where the grass is available. This grass is not nutritious pasture which is meant for dairy production. So because of that, these animals does not get sufficient nutrition to produce. And sometimes because of the roaming around to get that grass, they spend a lot of energy for their maintenance. So the production is also affected. So now there's a requirement that we must have proper pasture cultivated and fed to these animals. And still pasture is not recognized as a crop. So that is another problem. So now it is high time that we should think about this. And also most of the land, as Mr. Rajadurai said, belongs to the government. So even when there are investors who invest for commercial scale farming, the main problem they face is to get proper land. Because huge extents of land, at least maybe a few hundred hectares, will be needed. So it is the only place where they can get this type of land is government. So government must have some clear policies so that some land can be released for this, because there are, I know personally, there had been a few years back, some parties came, foreign parties, who were interested to invest here in dairy farming. And then they came and had discussions several times, and finally they gave up because they could not get land because of certain, red tape. So I think government has to think about that. And even now, we are spending a huge amount of foreign exchange to import milk powder. And we produce only about 40% of our requirement. 60% is imported. And I think year before last, about 97,000 tons of milk powder was imported at a huge cost of about more than 90 billion rupees. So land is very important for dairying.
Yes, Dr. Rajadurai. Based on what I understand, you are a big proponent of formal zonal demarcation of land for different agricultural activities. Why is that?
As I showed very clearly, certain districts have a concentration of certain crops that they have grown successfully. So I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel. The infrastructure and the setup is already there. The government can release the land that is in those districts for selected crops. I think we can easily enlarge our agricultural profile. And the other important thing is, now if you look at upcountry, other than tea, there is nothing we can grow in the upcountry. Of course, forestry we can do, but the government forestry policy, for example, one of the things is very duplicitous, because there is a law saying that you cannot harvest anything above 5,000 feet, right? Because you cannot grow anything other than tea and vegetable crops and some fruit crops. But because of the attraction that agriculture has for or does not have for informal sector workers, we can't attract people to grow those in commercial skills. They can do their home garden and grow some fruit trees. So if you are going to be a very strong agricultural economy, then we need to release or let go some of the government land, even for fuel load. I think when we say fuel load, people get very alarmed, but one has to only go and stand near the Avisavela bridge to count the number of lorries bringing firewood to the tea country or tea estates. They don't have tea fuel wood plantations in the low country, so obviously they are denuding or cutting the government forests or low country forests, whereas we have 20,000 hectares cultivated with a loan from ADB. They did a scientific study and recommended cultivation of fuel wood, and we have cultivated for use. So fuel wood is not anything evil. Every country does it in a scientific way. When you cut a fuel wood tree, you leave the stump. There's no disturbance to the root system or soil, and it regenerates, it copies us. So things like that, I think we should have very, very clear policy, especially in the upcountry. We operate in the upcountry. We have nothing else to at commercial scale. So we need to zone. We need to provide areas that are eroded, that are not suitable for tea or any commercial cultivation for fuel wood. Then we save the wet country, wet zone forests. Like that, certain areas in the central province can be zoned for export agriculture crops, given all the support. So I think there's a good case for zoning, and we have a very efficient government infrastructure in terms of resources to clear land, maybe 100, 200 hectares, and give a greenfield cultivator or company to grow certain specific crops. Like in the free trade zone, if they can clear about 1,000 hectares and invite companies to take 200 hectare blocks, I'm sure we can enlarge our agriculture footprint, because people are willing. As he mentioned, there are big companies and corporates willing to invest and participate in agriculture, but the space is not there. So much of bureaucracy, so much of permission raj. So then people just simply give up. So zoning is the first place to start, but before we do zoning, we must have a competent, non-partisan committee deciding on land use and agriculture policy for the province or a district, and we must go according to that blueprint, not do things ad hoc.
Yes, Mr. Fernando, would such a zoning blueprint benefit the dairy industry as well, or do you think much more needs to be done in terms of the issues the dairy industry faces in terms of the pasture and fodder crops?
Yes, because now, as I said earlier, our daily average production per cow is about 3 liters. That is very less. The main reason is feeding. You have to feed the cow properly, then only you can get. Now, up to about 6 liters you can produce mainly on pasture. Cow is a ruminant, so mainly you have to give leaf, cellulose. It can digest cellulose. But when you don't have enough pasture or quality pasture, you have to fill the gap. So when you fill the gap, you have to give concentrate feed, which is again made out of other agricultural produce. Now, a few days back, I saw in news, they have raided the place where they were selling rice for animal feed. So now, one thing is when you use such crops for concentrate, the cost of production goes up of milk. But if you have proper nutritious pasture cultivated, you don't have to do that. And then when you, now pasture is a crop, it is converted by the cow for our food. It is converted into milk, and finally we consume it. So it's logical that we treat it as a crop, because it has to be grown as any other crop with right agricultural practices, fertilizing, irrigation, everything. So if we do that, we can very easily increase our production. Now we have a cow population of about 800,000. Out of that, every year, half of that, about 55% of that is coming into milking. So the main reason is normally you have to get a calf every year, but because of poor nutrition, they don't calf every year. the calving interval is, very long. And also you have to get 300 days milk in one calving. But because of poor nutrition, in about 180 days, the cows go dry. So that is, we are not harvesting our full potential. Now, even if some might say that, we can import cows. But even if you import cow, you have to feed them. If you don't have proper feed here, even from those animals, you cannot get desired outcome. So productivity is low because one main reason is nutrition. So that's why I'm telling we have to have proper policies. And also this, as I said earlier, there has to be, because of these poor farmers, small farmers, there are so many things they cannot do on their own. Because of that, you have to give them the necessary support, organized support, like, even feeding when they don't have land to cultivate. Maybe we can develop some entrepreneurs who will cultivate pasture and sell. And also, one good thing is now there's a dry period, but you don't have to, store water to cultivate in the dry period when it comes to pasture, because we can cultivate pasture during the wet season and preserve pasture. So there are so many areas where you get enough water during the rainy season. So if you have enough land and have some, organized way of tackling it, you can produce pasture and store it by way of silage or something, and which can be, farmers are prepared because now we have a very good price for milk. Liter of milk can be sold by farmers around 105 rupees, 110 rupees. So that is a very good price. And we are importing so much of milk powder. So there's a ready market. For most of the products, the most difficult part is finding a market. But milk, there is a market, but no milk. And I know all the processors put together right now has processing capacity almost 3 times the production of the country. And because of that, all the processors are fighting each other for the available milk. So almost all the factories are running at low capacity. So if we increase the milk production, we can, one thing is rural economy will get more money, and also we can save foreign exchange.
Yes. Dr. Rajadurai, you mentioned the fact that the government does own around 80 to 85% of the land mass in Sri Lanka, and that may be a deterrent to productivity in the agricultural sector. But we see even when the government owned land is reallocated for agriculture, for example, in the case of plantations, we see that a lot of that land remains uncultivated or underutilized. What are the reasons for these inefficiencies, and in what ways can we improve this, the productivity of such land?
Uncultivated land, this story we heard, I think it's a misconception and it's a myth. There is no uncultivated land in the plantation sector. If you just travel up to Nuvarelia, you'd see that every nook and corner and every available space is cultivated by workers and balances in economic crop like tea. So much so that sometimes they have very good rules. If you are a manager, you go on leave and come on Friday. Sunday evening when you come, there's a brand new vegetable plot with inserted beets. So there is a severe demand for vegetable cultivation. And uncultivated land, when they say there are areas that by compulsion, that by law we cannot touch, like steep areas, landslide, reservations. These are the ones that people say uncultivated land. There is no cultivable land that is not cultivated. So that I must make it very clear. I think the foreigners were very smart. They cultivated every inch of the land and ensured that the maximum productivity was got. But we have estates where the old seedling tea is there, which is not economical. That is, we make a point to convert those into valuable fuel wood. generating land so that it can feed the dryers, and then we can save the trees in the low country. And a lot of people are asking, we had a ministerial meeting, they said, will you all give the land to the workers? We were totally in agreement with that, but the reality is that people are not willing to now come and work on the plantation sector because of so many issues. We understand that in the current 150-year-old archaic model, I don't think anybody likes to come and work as daily paid workers. So here is a crop. We have a tea crop, which is a very good crop. People earn a lot of money. They don't want to come and just do the simplest operation of picking because of so many other issues, dignity issues and other issues. So I don't think even if we give land to individual workers that they are going to do large scale agriculture. They might do home gardening if the land is near their home or their house, but not they don't have the capacity, they don't have the willingness and the commitment to do large scale, commercial scale like 1 hectare, 2 hectare agriculture. They don't have the capital in the first place. So the plantation sector, we are fully supportive of the government initiatives to promote food crops for their consumption. Not only food, we have made use of all the water bodies. We have introduced fingerlings because tilapia is a nutritious supplement for workers. So likewise, every available space now, particularly now under these conditions, we are utilized for growing of food crops, like yam crops, tuber crops. It's already work in progress.
In the interest of time, I will ask the last question from Mr. Fernando. Dr. Rajadurai in his presentation said that it's a myth that this country has a water shortage, that this country does receive enough rain. But from what I understand, one of the issues that the dairy industry is facing, especially given that a lot of the farmers do live in the dry zone, is a shortage of water again for fodder and pasture crops. So is this a problem of irrigation then, that we don't have proper allocation of the water that we receive?
I think Mr. Rajadurai explained it very well. We have enough water resources. What we have to do is to manage properly. If we manage properly, I don't think there's a scarcity. And also, as I mentioned earlier, for pasture and fodder, we can cultivate during the rainy season when there's excess water also, which is going down to the rivers, to the ocean. So we can cultivate and then conserve. So as far as livestock is concerned, I don't think there is any water shortage as such. I think if you manage the available water properly, there won't be any problem.
Just to add to what he said, our annual average rainfall is close to 2,000 millimeters, and we have 4 rainfall seasons covering the whole year. So I don't know how we can think that we have water shortage. In fact, we have an excess because 40% is surface runoff that is also captured. Balance seeps into the ground as aquifers. So we don't have water problem. It's how we use it and distribute it. I showed you enough maps to demonstrate that tanks, rivers, riverine system, water is plentiful in our country for agriculture.
I think that's why it's important to have this kind of conversation so that we can dispel myths and initiate the necessary reforms. Thank you so much, Dr. Rajadurai and Mr. Fernando, for joining us in this conversation.